The video introduces Sylvia Browne as one of the most recognizable and controversial figures in modern American psychic history. Far more than a fringe personality, Browne became a household name through frequent appearances on national television, radio programs, and best-selling books that reached millions of readers. Her calm, authoritative tone and confident delivery gave her predictions an air of certainty that deeply resonated with audiences searching for meaning beyond conventional explanations. Unlike many psychics who relied on vague symbolism, Browne developed a reputation for making unusually specific statements about future events, personal destinies, and global shifts, details that would later fuel both fascination and debate. What solidified her lasting cultural influence was not merely her popularity during her lifetime, but the way certain predictions seemed to echo real-world developments years after they were made. Supporters point to moments when global crises, social unrest, or sudden historical turns appeared to mirror scenarios she had outlined long before they entered public awareness. These perceived alignments transformed Browne from a media personality into a figure of retrospective scrutiny, as old interviews and book passages resurfaced during times of uncertainty. For many, these parallels suggested an unsettling possibility that her visions tapped into something beyond coincidence. At the same time, critics have long argued that selective memory, broad interpretation, and confirmation bias play powerful roles in elevating her reputation after the fact. Yet, even skeptics acknowledge Browne's unique ability to articulate collective fears in a way that felt prophetic once events unfolded. Her words often captured emotional truths, anxiety about loss, distrust in institutions, and fear of the unknown, that later became dominant themes in society. Ultimately, the video frames Sylvia Browne not simply as a psychic, but as a cultural mirror. Whether viewed as a genuine seer or a skilled interpreter of human unease, her legacy endures because her predictions continue to intersect with global events in ways that provoke reflection, discomfort, and an enduring question: coincidence or something more? Browne's 2008 book End of Days became the cornerstone of her modern legacy when readers revisited its pages more than a decade later. In the book, she described the emergence of a severe global respiratory illness around the year 2020, an event that, at the time of publication, sounded distant and implausible. She wrote of a fast-spreading disease that attacked the lungs, created widespread panic, overwhelmed systems of care, and then mysteriously receded. For years, these passages attracted little attention, remaining just one of many speculative predictions in a long catalog of prophetic claims. Everything changed when COVID-19 erupted in late 2019 and rapidly paralyzed the world in 2020. As nations entered lockdowns and news coverage focused relentlessly on respiratory failure, viral spread, and global disruption, readers began circulating excerpts from End of Days across social media. The apparent alignment between Browne's words and real events ignited a surge of renewed interest in her work. Many were struck not only by the timing, but by the nature of the illness she described: respiratory, global, and socially destabilizing, which seemed to mirror lived reality with unsettling clarity. Even more disturbing for followers was Browne's additional warning: the illness would return roughly 10 years later. This detail transformed her prediction from a single eerie coincidence into an ongoing source of anxiety. If the first part appeared fulfilled, people wondered whether the second chapter was still ahead. As a result, End of Days re-entered public discussion not as a forgotten psychic text, but as a potential roadmap for future uncertainty. Skeptics argued that such predictions rely on broad language and retrospective interpretation, cautioning against reading prophecy into complex scientific phenomena. Yet emotionally, the impact was undeniable. Browne's words gave shape to collective fear, offering a narrative that made chaos feel pre-written rather than random. In that sense, her prediction did more than forecast illness. It reshaped how many people emotionally processed a global crisis, blending fear, fascination, and the haunting possibility that the story was not yet finished. She framed the 2020s not as a decade defined by a single catastrophic event, but as an extended period of confusion and deep spiritual crisis. According to Browne's vision, humanity would enter an era where rapid technological advancement outpaced emotional and spiritual maturity. Devices, algorithms, and constant digital stimulation would dominate daily life, leaving individuals perpetually connected yet internally exhausted. Rather than creating clarity or unity, technology would flood people with information while stripping them of meaning, producing mental overload and a chronic sense of disorientation. Central to this crisis was the erosion of trust in institutions that once provided stability. Governments, media, religious organizations, and scientific authorities would increasingly be viewed with suspicion. Conflicting narratives, shifting truths, and visible contradictions would leave people unsure of whom or what to believe. This collapse of trust, Browne suggested, would not lead to healthy skepticism, but to widespread cynicism and fear as individuals lost confidence not only in leaders, but in their own judgment. At a personal level, Browne described a growing emotional isolation. Families would live under the same roof, yet feel disconnected. Conversations would grow shallow, and authentic human presence would be replaced by screens. Even in crowded cities and online networks, people would feel profoundly alone. This isolation would feed a deeper inner emptiness, a quiet spiritual hunger that no amount of entertainment, consumption, or digital validation could satisfy. For Browne, the danger of the 2020s lay in its subtlety. There would be no clear enemy to fight, no obvious moment of collapse. Instead, the decade would wear people down slowly, draining purpose and weakening the human spirit. This prolonged confusion, she believed, was not the end itself, but a preparation, forcing humanity to confront what it had neglected and decide whether to continue drifting or begin searching again for meaning, truth, and spiritual grounding. Environmental instability in Browne's vision is not merely a scientific or ecological problem, but a symbolic reflection of humanity's inner condition. She described erratic weather patterns, sudden temperature extremes, and unusual natural phenomena as outward signs of a deeper spiritual imbalance. In this framework, nature is not acting randomly or independently. It is responding to the collective state of the human soul. When humanity becomes disconnected from purpose, compassion, and reverence, the natural world begins to mirror that disorder. Browne emphasized that while science would offer data-driven explanations, climate cycles, atmospheric changes, and environmental degradation, these interpretations alone would feel incomplete. According to her perspective, statistics and models could describe what was happening, but not why it felt so unsettling. The strange unease people would experience during these environmental shifts was, in her view, an intuitive recognition that something more profound was wrong. Nature itself would seem confused, expressing imbalance through unpredictable rhythms and unfamiliar behaviors. She spoke of deserts receiving sudden rains, storms forming without clear patterns, and winds carrying an indefinable heaviness that left people anxious or unsettled. These were not presented as punishments, but as warnings, signals urging humanity to pay attention. Browne believed the earth functions as a living mirror, reflecting humanity's moral and spiritual health back to itself. When greed, arrogance, and disconnection dominate human life, harmony with the natural world deteriorates. In this interpretation, environmental instability becomes a call rather than a curse. It challenges humanity to look beyond surface-level solutions and examine the deeper causes of imbalance. Browne's message suggests that true restoration cannot come solely from technological fixes or policy changes. Healing the planet, she implied, requires healing the human spirit, restoring humility, responsibility, and a renewed sense of connection to life itself. Browne foresaw a profound and escalating conflict between faith and technology, one that would define humanity's inner struggle in the modern age. She did not condemn technology as inherently evil. Rather, she warned of a tipping point where digital systems and algorithms would begin to replace the very qualities that make humans spiritually alive. In her vision, tools designed to assist life would quietly become authorities over it, shaping decisions once guided by intuition, prayer, moral reflection, and inner wisdom. As reliance on technology deepened, Browne believed people would increasingly trust data over discernment. In moments of uncertainty, instead of turning inward or upward for guidance, individuals would seek answers from screens, metrics, and automated systems. Algorithms would recommend not only what to buy or watch, but how to think, feel, and even believe. Over time, this dependence would dull the inner voice, the quiet sense of meaning that cannot be quantified or programmed. The result would not be efficiency alone, but a subtle spiritual atrophy. Browne described this shift as especially dangerous because it would feel comfortable and logical. Convenience would mask the loss. People would enjoy faster solutions, personalized systems, and constant digital reassurance, rarely noticing that something essential was missing. Genuine human presence would be replaced by virtual interaction and reflection by constant stimulation. The soul, she warned, cannot survive in a state of perpetual noise. By framing the choice as life with a soul or without one, Browne underscored the existential nature of this conflict. It was not a battle between progress and regression or religion and science, but between conscious, meaningful living and passive existence. Technology could coexist with faith, she believed, only if it remained a servant rather than a master. Ultimately, her warning was a call for balance. Humanity would be forced to decide whether it would use technology as a tool aligned with spiritual values or surrender its inner authority to machines. In that choice, Browne suggested, the future character of human life would be determined. She warned of an invisible force quietly draining meaning from human life, a presence that could not be seen, measured, or directly confronted. Unlike wars, disasters, or disease, this force worked in silence, eroding the inner foundations of purpose and identity. Browne described it as a slow dimming of the human spirit, where people continued to function outwardly, working, communicating, consuming, while feeling increasingly hollow inside. The danger, she emphasized, was not collapse, but numbness. Technology played a central role in intensifying this process. Constant connectivity created the illusion of closeness while weakening genuine human bonds. Conversations became abbreviated, emotions filtered through screens, and relationships replaced by digital substitutes. Browne believed that as technology absorbed more attention, it crowded out stillness, reflection, and inner listening. Without silence, the soul had no space to speak. Over time, individuals lost touch not only with others, but with themselves. Equally destructive was the loss of purpose. Browne foresaw a society driven by productivity, status, and distraction, yet unable to answer the fundamental question of why life matters. Success would be measured externally, while inner fulfillment steadily declined. People would wake each day feeling an undefined heaviness, unable to explain their dissatisfaction. This was not simply sadness or depression, but a deeper spiritual fatigue, an absence of meaning rather than the presence of pain. Weakened human connection completed this cycle of detachment. Families would coexist without intimacy, communities would fracture, and empathy would erode. People would feel alone even in crowds, unseen despite constant exposure. Browne warned that when connection disappears, compassion soon follows, leaving societies emotionally brittle and easily manipulated by fear. In her vision, this invisible force thrived where purpose was neglected and connection ignored. The remedy, she implied, was not technological retreat, but spiritual remembrance, reclaiming meaning through faith, presence, and authentic human bonds. Without that return, humanity risked surviving materially while slowly disappearing from within. Environmental instability, in Browne's vision, is far more than a consequence of atmospheric science or ecological mismanagement. She described erratic weather patterns and strange natural phenomena as a living mirror of humanity's spiritual sickness. In this perspective, the earth is not separate from human consciousness, but deeply intertwined with it. When humanity loses balance internally through greed, disconnection, and neglect of spiritual values, the natural world begins to reflect that disorder externally. Browne acknowledged that science would attempt to explain these changes through climate models, rising temperatures, and environmental degradation. However, she believed such explanations addressed only the surface of the problem. While data could describe what was happening, it could not explain why the changes felt so deeply unsettling to people across cultures. According to her interpretation, the unease stirred by unpredictable weather was intuitive, a soul-level recognition that something fundamental was out of alignment. She spoke of seasons losing their rhythm, storms arriving without warning, and landscapes behaving in unfamiliar ways. These were not framed as punishments, but as signals, messages urging humanity to pause and reflect. The earth, in Browne's words, would appear confused because it was responding to a confused humanity. As compassion weakened and meaning eroded, harmony between human life and nature began to fracture. In this view, environmental instability becomes a warning rather than a sentence. It challenges humanity to look inward instead of seeking solutions solely through technology or policy. Browne suggested that healing the planet requires more than innovation. It requires restoration of humility, responsibility, and spiritual awareness. Only by addressing the deeper imbalance within the human soul, she believed, could true harmony with the natural world be restored. Browne foresaw a growing conflict between faith and technology as one of the defining struggles of the modern era. In her vision, this conflict did not arise suddenly, but unfolded gradually as humanity became increasingly dependent on digital systems to guide everyday life. Algorithms began to influence not only what people consumed or how they communicated, but also how they made decisions, formed beliefs, and understood truth. What once required inner reflection, prayer, or moral contemplation was slowly delegated to machines optimized for efficiency rather than meaning. She warned that as trust in technology expanded, trust in intuition and inner wisdom would quietly erode. People would look to data, predictions, and automated recommendations for reassurance, while the subtle voice of conscience grew faint. Browne believed this shift was spiritually dangerous because the soul cannot be quantified or programmed. When decisions are stripped of empathy, silence, and spiritual awareness, human life becomes functional but hollow, effective yet disconnected from purpose. Prayer and contemplation, in her view, were not outdated rituals, but essential practices that kept humanity anchored to something greater than logic. As these practices faded, individuals would feel an unexplainable emptiness, despite having unprecedented access to information and convenience. The more advanced technology became, the deeper the sense of loss would grow, because what was missing could not be generated by code or calculated by machines. By framing the choice as life with a soul or without one, Browne emphasized the existential nature of this conflict. It was not a rejection of progress, but a warning against surrendering inner authority. Technology, she believed, should remain a tool guided by human values, not a replacement for spiritual discernment. Ultimately, humanity would be forced to decide whether it would live consciously, grounded in faith and inner truth, or drift into a future of efficiency devoid of meaning. In Browne's vision, modern cities evolve into cages without bars, not through overt oppression, but through subtle systems of control driven by convenience and passive surveillance. People are not forcibly confined. Instead, they willingly surrender freedom in exchange for comfort, efficiency, and a sense of safety. Cameras, data tracking, and interconnected technologies quietly monitor daily life, shaping behavior without resistance. Over time, individuals stop questioning these systems because they appear helpful, seamless, and normal. The loss of freedom occurs so gradually that it is barely noticed. This environment, Browne warned, erodes creativity and individuality. When every action is guided, recorded, or optimized, spontaneous human expression begins to fade. Cities become orderly and efficient, yet emotionally sterile. Public spaces lose warmth, and human interaction is replaced by compliance and routine. People live close together but feel increasingly isolated, disconnected from both one another and their inner sense of self. The cage is psychological rather than physical, built from habit and silent conformity. Compounding this danger is the loss of moral clarity among leaders. Browne foresaw a time when those in power continue to speak, but no longer speak with truth. Political, scientific, and institutional leaders would rely on rehearsed language and empty assurances, creating a growing gap between words and lived reality. As trust dissolves, fear fills the void. Citizens begin to doubt not only authority, but their own judgment. This breakdown fuels social fragmentation. Communities fracture, empathy weakens, and suspicion replaces solidarity. In such conditions, people cling to control and certainty, even at the cost of freedom. Browne's warning suggests that the greatest threat is not surveillance itself, but the quiet acceptance of it. When fear and convenience reshape society into a place where the body is free to move, but the spirit is confined. Browne described a sudden, nonviolent trigger event in 2026 that would not destroy cities or claim lives, yet would profoundly halt the world on a psychological level. Unlike disasters marked by fire, collapse, or visible devastation, this event would be strange and deeply unexplainable, defying existing frameworks of science, politics, and belief. Its power would lie not in physical damage, but in its ability to shatter humanity's sense of certainty and control. According to her vision, the event would arrive without warning and without clear cause. For a brief moment, normal routines would pause as people across the globe collectively asked the same unsettling question: what is happening? Governments and experts would rush to offer explanations, but none would fully satisfy. Competing theories would emerge, yet clarity would remain elusive. This absence of answers would prove more destabilizing than any immediate threat, creating a vacuum in which fear and confusion could rapidly grow. Browne emphasized that this trigger was not the beginning of chaos, but the catalyst that exposed what was already fragile. Years of spiritual neglect, emotional exhaustion, and dependence on external systems would suddenly surface. The quiet numbness many carried would intensify, transforming into anxiety, disorientation, and a loss of inner grounding. People would realize how deeply they had relied on the illusion of stability. This moment, she suggested, would accelerate spiritual and emotional breakdown because it stripped away assumptions about reality itself. When the rules people trusted no longer seemed reliable, inner strength became the only refuge. For those without a spiritual foundation, the shock would feel unbearable. For others, it would act as a painful awakening, forcing humanity to confront not an external enemy, but the emptiness and fear it had long ignored. Despite the darkness woven throughout her vision, Browne ultimately ended her message with hope rather than despair. She believed that moments of deep crisis do not only expose humanity's weaknesses, but also awaken its forgotten strengths. As fear, confusion, and spiritual emptiness reach an unbearable level, a quiet transformation begins, not through revolution or spectacle, but through individual hearts turning inward and upward. This awakening, she suggested, would unfold silently across the world, largely unnoticed by institutions or media. Browne envisioned a renewed return to faith, not as rigid doctrine, but as a deeply personal trust in something greater than human systems. People who had long abandoned prayer or spiritual reflection would find themselves instinctively seeking it again, often in moments of solitude and vulnerability. Faith would no longer feel optional or symbolic. It would become a lifeline. In a world where external structures fail to provide meaning or safety, inner belief would offer stability that no technology or authority could replace. This spiritual reawakening would naturally ripple into families and communities. Browne foresaw fractured relationships beginning to heal as pride softens and empathy returns. Conversations once avoided would slowly resume. Families separated by distraction, resentment, or fear would rediscover the value of presence and forgiveness. Communities, disillusioned with power and politics, would rebuild trust through shared values, kindness, and mutual support rather than ideology. At the core of this hope was Browne's conviction that faith and inner strength are humanity's true anchors. Survival, in her view, would not depend on wealth, intelligence, or technological advancement, but on the capacity to remain spiritually grounded amid uncertainty. Those anchored in faith would not be spared hardship, but they would not be broken by it. Through quiet courage, compassion, and remembrance of purpose, humanity could endure the darkness and rise renewed, wiser, and more deeply connected than before.